hello. Was it that one? Okay.
Kind of a focus on different topics. And we are down south in Vestmannaeyjar.
Sorry.
It has to be this one?
Yes.
Oh my God. Okay. So in Vestmannaeyjar, there are actually, I say we because there's two of us that are permanently based there. So it's me and Dr. Paul Wensvein. And the research center started in 2020, so we're a relatively recent research center. The aim of it is to investigate the biodiversity of the waters of Vestmannaeyjar and South Iceland, to work with education and also community engagement. We assess the importance of this region for different species of cetaceans. We look at things like temporal and spatial occurrence patterns, habitat use, population biology, and also behavior. But we also work across other regions of Iceland, and also we do work abroad. One of the projects we do, for example, that Paul is leading is the HIPMO project, and that is a project that has been going on for the last 4 years or so, and it's working on northern bottlenose whales. And so that takes him to other regions of Iceland, but also to the Azores, for example. So we do work also outside. And I will just give you a very brief overview of the research we do and why South Iceland. So South Iceland is a really interesting region because it receives these kind of warmer and saline water from the Atlantic. And but interestingly, it has a very narrow continental shelf. So it's the only part of Iceland where you can get the continental shelf as close to the mainland. And so there's very deep waters, and it creates this kind of very interesting ecosystem that might have different species of cetaceans inhabiting it. It's a very important area for fishing, so there's a lot of important prey. But there's very limited knowledge, especially in the coastal waters, of the cetacean diversity here. And the reason for that is because, hopefully people online can see this, and kind of here, across the whole length of the southern coast, there are no natural harbors. The only natural harbor is in the archipelago of the Westman Islands, which is Vestmannaeyjar, where we are. And so because of that, there's no whale watching activity. There's no really like a lot of monitoring of cetacean occurrence. Okay, so the work we do at the center is based mainly on very small boats. And we do work such as doing photo identification. So here at the top, we do visual observations of behavior of the whales. We do acoustic recordings. We do tissue sampling with biopsies, and we also look at prey when we can find it. We also do tagging, especially with suction cup tagging. So we use D tags, but also CATS tags for those of you that are familiar with these. So they can stay on the whales for a number of hours or maybe a day or two. But so they're quite short term, but they provide very high resolution information about the underwater behavior of the whales. We also have a team of observers on land that do observations and record all cetacean species that are observed during any day when the weather is good. They use binoculars and the theodolite. And so this is a point on the island that has a kind of really good view, really good overview of the whole archipelago. And so it's a great spot to register all the cetacean species that occur here. But of course, we also use passive acoustic monitoring because both me and Paul have a background in bioacoustics. So we had to do some acoustics work. And so what we do is we use moored hydrophones. And the advantage of these is because we can use being in Iceland, you have not experienced that maybe this time because the weather is glorious today, but we tend to get a lot of bad weather in Iceland. And so even in the summer, which is the only time that we can do our field work, we have quite a lot of limitations on data collection because of bad weather. And so the hydrophone really allows us to continue that monitoring throughout the year and in the long term. So we can compare years to years and look at trends. The other thing we do also is we look at the prey. So we do, in this map, you can see survey design for echo sounder surveys we do. So we try to look at fish prey and also krill. And then we also collaborate with this institute. And when they collect prey that is relevant for cetaceans like squid in their surveys, and we get those samples and then we analyze them in our lab. So I won't go through the work we have done with a lot of these species because it's quite recent, it's very preliminary, but just to give you kind of a broad overview, we see that this is a biodiverse region that is important in the summer as a feeding ground for many different species. But it remains also an important feeding area in the wintertime, especially for humpback whales and for fin whales, it seems. And we have detected deep divers on our mooring system. So our mooring sits kind of around here. So, and this is about 20 kilometers or so between here and here, maybe 30 kilometers. So we think that there might be a lot of other species that we have not studied so much in the shallow waters here, very nearby. So we're very keen to expand our research to these deep water regions and contrast these two neighboring ecosystems. But the species I'll talk to you more about today is really the killer whale, because that's where most of our work has been for the last 15 years. So the research, even though we've only started as a research center in 2020, I had actually started doing field work in the Westman Islands in 2008. So, and that was during my PhD. And this was became kind of the longest running dedicated killer whale research program in Iceland. And so most of the results of the work we've been doing that I'll show you today are about this project. But I'm happy to talk about the other species because I'm very interested in the other species. So please do come and talk to me afterwards if you want to talk about that. So as you all probably know, their killer whales can range throughout most of the world's oceans. And throughout their range, there are many different forms or ecotypes. But the best studied forms are in the North Pacific, and there's the so-called resident and transient or BIGS killer whales. Now, in killer whales, as I'm sure you probably also know, you really are what you eat. So if whatever they feed on determines a lot of the aspects of their lives. And so, for example, the residents, they feed on fish, primarily salmon. And so they live on matrilineal stable groups of large size, where offspring does not disperse from the group even when they mature. So they stay with their mother throughout their lives. They're acoustically active during most behaviors and have group-specific repertoires. Whereas the transients, they feed mostly on marine mammals. And because of that, they have smaller groups. The offspring disperses from the group. And they are silent except after a kill or when they're milling. So these two types of killer whales, even though they live in the same area, they do not socially or genetically mix. So they're completely segregated. Now, what happens is that, for example, the residents have been shown to be so strict in their diet specialization that when the salmon stock has decreased, then you also see demographic consequences on the population of this decrease in the prey. So you see increased whale mortality and you see decreased whale births. And this is even though there are other species of salmon around that they could feed on. So they have such a preference for one specific type of salmon that it can really impact their population viability. Now, in Iceland, we've known, at least for decades, but probably for centuries, that herring fishermen see killer whales very often when they're fishing for herring. And so the idea was that if this is how killer whales behave, that they tend to be very specialized in the prey that they feed on, then the Icelandic whales must be herring specialists. But this had not really been studied in detail. So we tried to look a little bit at this. And we started by looking at the movements of whales. And why? The reason is because the herring stock, moves around different areas throughout the year. So as it goes through different life stages, it will go between a spawning life stage, a feeding life stage, and overwintering. It will move around and it will be in different parts of Iceland. And so we used photo identification. So in killer whales, we used the dorsal fin and the saddle patch, this area here, to identify individual whales. And we wanted to see if we got photographs from different regions, if the whales were following the herring. So as you know, we had been already collecting data here in the south of Iceland in the summertime. So in the summertime, this is a spawning ground for herring. So that's why we get killer whales there. And then what we did was we had the opportunity when the herring was coming into these fjords in West Iceland during the winter to collect photo identification data there. And what we did when we compared what we saw was that only about half of the population was actually matched between these two locations. So not all of the whales were traveling between the winter and the summer herring grounds. Some of the whales were only seen seasonally in either one of the places or the other. And then using actually social media by chance, we found that some of the whales that were wintering in Iceland were actually traveling all the way to Scotland in spring and in the summer. So here in this map, what you can see is different kind of feeding grounds, spawning grounds, and overwintering grounds of herring. This is where we took the pictures in the winter time. And then these are the dots where they were seen in Scotland. These, I should say, all these photos from Scotland were from, like I said, from citizen scientists. So people on social media contributing their photos, and then we were able to match them. So that's how we found that there was this movement. What was interesting about it also was that when the whales were seen in Iceland, they were very consistently seen feeding on herring. But when they were in Scotland, they were continuously seen harassing seals. So this kind of suggested that maybe they were not so very strict in their diet. But to look at this a bit further, what we did was to collect biopsy samples, and we also collected prey at the same time. We were using stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen that should give an idea of the diet of the individual integrated over the last few weeks, maybe a few months. And we sampled prey at the same time and location, like I said. So here you have a graph showing you the stable isotope values for nitrogen and carbon. And these are all in separate individuals that we sampled. And we photographed these individuals, and we knew that they were traveling between the winter and the summer feeding grounds. So we thought these, from the photo ID, we classified these whales as probably herring specialists. Because we sampled the fish, we were able to actually plot where we would expect a whale that feeds primarily on herring to be in this kind of isotopic space. And that's where it should be. So these whales were grouping really nicely around the values that they should have if their diet is predominantly composed of herring. Then when we added whales that we had only seen seasonally, we could see that many of them were still in this kind of cloud down here, but some were way up here where it didn't suggest a diet composed mostly from herring. Then we added whales, those are the triangles, whales that we knew were matched between Iceland and Scotland. And so this is one of those whales, and you can see that it was then confirmed, again from citizen scientists, hunting and feeding on a gray seal. And so this showed us from the kind of, keep in mind that this is a short time frame, right, of a few weeks, maybe a few months, that over that time period, some of the whales seemed to feed predominantly on herring, while others were feeding on higher trophic level prey. Now, we also did a review of all the different prey that have been ever reported in Iceland, where killer whales have been observed kind of preying on different species. And we could see that there was a variety of different prey that was targeted. Now, for most of these cases, we don't actually know who the individual whales were, unfortunately. But what it suggests is that there's possibly other foraging strategies also occurring in Iceland, not just this kind of herring specialist or a mixed diet whale, but that there might be, for example, marine mammal specialists. So it's still potentially much more complex than we know so far. But the other thing we did with the same biopsies was to then look at genetics. And so this was a study done by one of our students a few years ago, and it was looking at microsatellites. And using that, she was able to kind of differentiate 3 genetic units, but the differentiation between them was very weak. And this is the same plot that I just showed you before of the stable isotopes, but now the whales are colored by their genetic unit. So you can see there's a lot of overlap in diet from whales of with different that are belonging to different genetic units. What was interesting about it was also that she, well, I keep saying it was interesting for us, but was that the whales also were very socially connected. So what you can see here is each circle is an individual whale. They are colored again by their genetic units. And what you can see is that whales from different genetic units, every time they are associating with another individual, they get a link in this network. And so you can see that the network is completely connected. There's no kind of segregation, social segregation, like we expect from whales with different diets that we see in the Pacific. So what we're seeing is that in the Atlantic, the picture is very different, at least here in Iceland, but we have colleagues in Norway doing similar studies, and it seems like in the Atlantic, there's a very different picture. Now, like I said in the beginning, my background is initially acoustics. That's why I came here to study the Icelandic whale. So a lot of the work we've been doing is also trying to understand the acoustic communication and behavior of these whales. Now, this was work actually done prior to us starting. Is the reason why I knew there were whales in Vestmannaeyjar is because of people like Fernando and, and Malene Simon, who had been here working and published work about it that I read, and then we knew that there were whales in Vestmannaeyjar. So for example, from those studies, we knew that the whales travel mostly in silence, but then they're very vocal when they're feeding and socializing. We still don't know if they have groups dialects, like some of the other killer whales in the Pacific. But they have very unique acoustic signals, this population, but the communication, the function of them is not always known. So for example, Malene described the herding call, which is a unique call for killer whales because it's the only context-specific call that exists of any population in the world. So it's a very interesting call produced during feeding that the whales are producing, and we think that it's because to have an effect on the prey. So it's not for communication between the whales, but it's to have an effect on the prey. But the herding call is not produced in all feeding events. So why it's produced, why do the whales choose to produce it is something we don't quite know yet. We also described how these whales make very low frequency sounds and very high frequency whistles. So this line here shows you the ultrasonic range, so where we humans cannot hear anymore. And these whales produce whistles in that ultrasonic range. Again, something we don't know exactly what the function is. And we've recently described, also this was work of one of our PhD students, that killer whales produce call sequences. So the way they arrange the sounds they produce is not random. There's some type of information there, but again, we don't know what. So one of the exciting things we've been doing in the last few years, and we have one more year this summer to go on this project. It's a collaboration with Professor Patrick Miller at the Sea Mammal Research Unit in the UK, and also some colleagues in Japan, is to put tags on the whales, so suction cup tags. I'm gonna try to play this video. I hope it works and you can hear the sounds, because the main thing we're trying to do is really use them, this tag data, to look at whether we can understand a little bit better the function of the sounds. Okay, I'm gonna play this, if this works. Oh no, you cannot hear. It's only playing on my computer. Can you hear that? So that's fish there. That was a herding call followed by a tail slap, which the whales use to slap the herring. And then the herring gets kind of stunned and they feed on it one by one. And I don't know if you could hear the sound after when the whales were sucking the herring. So that was really cool because I had been listening to tag data for a long time before, and I always heard this sound and I thought this must be the whales sucking the fish, but we just did not know because we didn't have the video there to show us what they
made the herring just faint, or they used the...
They use the tail. Yeah. So they're clicking, and then they produce this herding call. The herding call is thought to kind of make the swim bladder of the herring vibrate, and so the herring just clumps together even tighter, and then they use the tail slap. So it's like a tool to make the feeding even more efficient, so they hit more fish, and then they feed on it one by one. And that's most of the time. Sometimes they bite, but many times they just suck the fish. And that's where you can hear the kind of slurping sounds. Okay, so that's something I hope to have some more results in a while to show you. But that's really exciting that we can use that data now to really know kind of in much more detail what behavior the whales have when they're producing different sounds. The other thing, we also used the same biopsy samples that I mentioned before, was to look at contaminants. This was a study actually done by colleagues of ours, not us. And what they looked at were a number of different types of contaminants, but PCBs were, of course, the ones that killer whales had the most. But again, what was important here was to see that the whales we had from the photographic data, from the stable isotope data, that we had classified as being herring specialists or mixed diet whales, they had very different levels of contaminants. So the whales that have a mixed diet have much higher levels of contaminants than the ones that feed primarily or exclusively on fish. And you can see there the risk thresholds for health effects, and the fact that the females tend to always have much lower levels than males because they offload those, as you probably all know, the contaminants to their calves. So what was really interesting about this was the time scale. So remember how before I said that stable isotopes are only giving us a window of kind of like weeks to months, but PCBs are accumulated, especially in males, throughout their lifetime. So what this showed us was that this was really, this strategy of having a mixed diet was not something that we just happened to see for a few months or a few weeks. It's something the whales are doing consistently and throughout their life. The other thing we've also recently started working on is interspecific interactions. Now, we're interested in this because, of course, predicting the consequences of future ecosystem changes requires us to understand also how interspecific interactions might change. So, for example, if you have a new species arriving that was not there before, how are the other species that are still in that habitat, how are they now going to interact, if they're going to interact? That might exacerbate or it might mitigate climate change effects. So that's what we have been seeing in our study site in the Westman Islands for the last few years, and most of this has been work of our PhD student, Anna Seldman. And we've seen that in the beginning, in 2008, and until 2014, we didn't really see pilot whales in our study area. And from 2014 onwards, we've kind of seen them pretty regularly and sometimes in quite high numbers. So there seems to be an increased occurrence of pilot whales in this area. They usually enter the area at speed. They're vocally very, very active, and they often interact with the killer whales. I will show you another video that I hope works of what these interactions might look like. So this is a group of pilot whales at the back there, and they're chasing a group of killer whales that's swimming at high speeds away and really avoiding the pilot whales. And our boat is just, going very fast, trying to keep up with the chase that is happening. Usually, we never see physical contact between them, and usually this just eventually stops. They start slowing down, and then they stop chasing. I can't recall the exact speed in this event, but it was at least 20 kilometers per hour. Yeah, so they were going fast. So the majority of the times that pilot whales enter the area, killer whales will avoid pilot whales. In most of the interactions, they simply move out. And in some of the situations, they will go at high speed, like what we saw, and like a proper chase will ensue. Now, there's energetic consequences, perhaps, of these interactions to the killer whales, because they often will abandon a feeding event. So they will be feeding, and we can see pilot whales. Sometimes we can hear pilot whales before we can see them. And we suspect that's actually what's happening with the killer whales. So they can detect acoustically the pilot whales at the distance, and they react before the pilot whales even come anywhere near them. And they just move away. Now, many times we see the pilot whales swimming at very high speed and then just milling in the area where the killer whales were feeding. Now, we don't know for sure what's happening, but one of the reasons could be that there's competition for the same prey. So, but unfortunately, pilot whales are very, very little studied in Iceland. And so one of the studies we are doing at the moment with the institute here is actually using stranded pilot whale samples and looking at stable isotopes. So we're looking at comparing some of the same chemical markers of diet that we've already analyzed on killer whales, comparing those to the pilot whales to look at this question of whether they are competing for the same prey. The other idea is that this is a mobbing strategy. Some bird species, for example, do that. They will mob their predators. Now, there's not many, there's actually only one, I know, case of a presumed predation event of killer whales on pilot whales in this region in Iceland. But it could be that there's just kind of a innate response of pilot whales. They just mob killer whales. Because we do know, we've been talking also with a lot of colleagues, and we're doing a review of kind of these kind of events all over the world. And it seems to happen pretty much everywhere, that where pilot whales occur, killer whales tend to move away. But recently, in the last 2 years, we've also observed, just out of the blue, killer whale groups with a pilot whale newborn, just newborn, still with fetal folds. And so, and we have no idea how it started or how it ends, whether the pilot whale calf is killed, abandoned, or we know it doesn't stay, at least with the group on one occasion, because we saw the same group the day after, and they did not have the calf with them anymore. But what it showed us was that for the first time we were seeing a hint that maybe killer whales are maybe taking a revenge or something. And something is happening also on the other side. So it's not just the pilot whales chasing the killer whales, but something else is happening. So these interactions are behaviorally very complex, and something we're really excited to do more work on. So one of the ways we've been studying this is our student, Anna. She has been conducting playback experiments. So because, like I said, we think that this starts with the killer whales detecting acoustically the pilot whales and then reacting. So what we're doing is tagging the killer whales, and then we have a boat that's with an observer team. And we have another boat that's the source boat. So it has a speaker, and it plays this cacophony of sounds. This is a spectrogram, so it's a visual representation of sound. And what it shows you is all these lines are pilot whales vocalizing. And they tend to make this very chaotic vocal behavior when they're approaching killer whales. And we don't know if it's to make them sound like they're many or what it is. So we're also trying to study the vocal behavior of pilot whales to understand a bit better why they make this specific vocal behavior. But that's what we are playing to simulate an approach of pilot whales and see how our tagged whale reacts to that simulated approach of pilot whales, because that gives us a really kind of detailed overview of how killer whales might respond, whether they do abandon feeding events, and how that might depend on the composition of the group. For example, maybe they only respond if they have calves on the group or something like that. Okay, so to summarize, if we go back to that board we had in the beginning and we put the Icelandic whales there, we can see that the picture is a little bit less clear. So we have fish specialists, we have mixed diet whales, perhaps we have more feeding strategies. We don't know yet because it's too soon. Our study is very young compared to the decades of long-term research that have happened in the Pacific. We don't know yet if the groups are stable in the long term over decades and whether offspring disperse or not. But we think that it is likely that at least some groups do have a similar social structure to the residents, but it's less hierarchical. But it's still unresolved because of the way that we, like I said to you before, we don't know yet of if the group specific repertoires exist or not, but they are possible. And we know acoustically that the whales are very active during feeding, but they're silent during travel. So that's very different from the residents that are vocal always. And that could be because herring has much more sensitive hearing than salmon. So it's costly for the whales perhaps to be vocalizing all the time because herring might detect that. But there is no social and genetic segregation between whales with different diet habits in Iceland. So that's something we are trying to work on more to see also how possibly related they are and how much mating there might be. So in terms of the future work, we are continuing work on looking at effects of environmental changes. One of the interesting things about herring is that it goes through very big cycles of superabundance and then nearly crashing. And so the whales must be able to deal with that. And so we are trying to understand better how those changes affect the population. Connectivity across different regions of the North Atlantic, because as we have seen, they move around quite a bit. And a better understanding of how diet influences the social and acoustic behavior, and also the occurrence and impacts of interspecific interactions. And in terms of the other species, like I mentioned, most of our work has been with the pilot whales. I mentioned a little bit of that. We've also been working with blue whales and with humpback whales, especially with humpback whale song that we can detect on the hydrophone in the wintertime. And so for the future, we want to continue expanding that work and measuring the prey much more than we have done. That's a very recent addition to our work. And also we are hoping to look at expand our work with PAM, with the passive acoustic monitoring, and do a lot more around Iceland as well, and work on the deeper waters. And that's it. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
I've heard that before that pilot whales are pulling kilos, but I mean, how big are the groups? Because apparently, according to your acoustic, they sound bigger than they really are, because there's a cost, and if it's like killer whales probably do the same with sperm whales, because they've found scars, killer whale scars. Not killing the sperm whales. I had students some years back, and they found a lot of scars on the flukes of sperm whales, probably killer whales trying to chase sperm whales away from the same feeding grounds. I guess the same problem here with the pilot whale and killer whale, maybe for competition. But how big are the groups chasing them?
Yeah, so that was one of the... oh, sorry.
Summarize the question.
Oh, okay.
And then I will walk with the microphone in the next question.
Oh, yes. Okay. So the question was, just very, very briefly summarized, was how big are the groups that are chasing the killer whales, the pilot whale groups. So we didn't have enough data to do statistics on it, but at least graphically, it seemed like when the killer whales respond with a high-speed avoidance, when there's an actual chase, then there's usually quite a big imbalance between the group size. So there tends to be groups of 5 or 6 killer whales, for example, so very small groups, and groups of maybe 100 pilot whales. So, and then when it's more of just a kind of slow avoidance where the killer whales stop feeding and move somewhere else, and then, but there's no chase, then there tends to be more of a similarity, or at least the pilot whale groups are not as big. So they can be maybe 30 pilot whales, but not 100 or 50 plus. So it seems like the bigger the group, the more kind of dramatic, let's say, the interaction is. But like I said, we didn't have really enough data to be able to quantify it.
Hi, you have a bunch of known killer whales, and I was wondering if you knew anything about when they are up hunting herring here, the group size and numbers, if that changes when they go south and go for marine mammals. So maybe some, like if some of that stuff with the group size is actually related to what is the most efficient way to be a predator on a fish school or a seal.
A little bit awkward.
What's that? Oh, no, it's fine, it's fine. Yeah, so when they are in the south, where we are, they are feeding also on herring. So there's no place in Iceland. Oh, in Scotland, yes. Yeah, so in Iceland, when they're feeding on herring, they are usually in huge aggregations, which is why it's so hard for us to study group-specific dialects, because we hardly ever can get them in just their group. You know, they're usually part of a huge aggregation. We can have 50 whales, we can have 100 whales in the same kind of area. And so when they are seen in Scotland, they tend to be more in their own group of maybe 5 or 6. So there's definitely a difference in the kind of size, the number of whales in the area versus in one place where they're feeding on herring versus the other where they're feeding on the seals. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, in a way, but some of this, I mean, this strict classification they have in the Pacific between transient and resident. You know, here you have some that do both, and maybe it's the best strategy to be a bigger group when you go for fish, and then, okay, we go down there, we do some seals, you go there, I go there. So it's more efficient, and at least the payback would be better.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why they, you know, the scientists that studied the Pacific whales were arguing that that's why they have these group sizes being so different, is exactly because of the payoff that they get from, you know, one seal cannot feed 100 whales. So, you know, you cannot be that many in a group. And also it will affect your stealth technique to catch the prey. If there's too many of you, you kind of lose the element of surprise. And so there's definitely that happening, we think, also. But the problem is also in Scotland, there's not as many, or there wasn't, at least when we were doing that work, as many observations. So most of, like I said, most of the information we get is from citizen scientists, and was just pictures, no data about, or rarely data about how many there were, you know, how many whales were in the area. So it was kind of difficult. And in Scotland, it's really tricky to study them because they can show up anywhere. And it's been really interesting to see how once well, just the evolution of the interests of the community in these whales, because now you have Facebook groups that are tracking the whales in real time. So, you know, someone will post, I've seen them here, and then someone will post, I've seen them over here, because they can track the coasts, you know, of the whole Shetland Islands, for example, for, you know, quite quickly. So if you are, it's not like us, we can be based in Vestmannaeyjar, and we know there will be killer whales showing up. It's much harder to do that kind of work in Scotland. So yes, but definitely I'm sure that's playing into it, the kind of how they organize themselves into making it an efficient hunting. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was really interesting. So I had a question. You touched upon one of the things that you wanted to do more of is to look at the interactions with killer whales in other parts of the North Atlantic, not just Scotland. And I assume that you're already working together with the colleagues in Norway, for example, then. And of course, so I was wondering how much overlap is there between, or how much exchange is there based on the photo ID between Norway and Iceland? And connected to that is these herding calls, because of course the herring feeding was something that has been studied for a long time in Norway, and Fernando was one of the first ones. But I haven't heard of these herding calls being identified in Norwegian waters. No.
Okay, so to answer the first question, we just had a student do a comparison between the Norwegian Orca Survey catalog and our catalog, and we couldn't find really any matches. But there has been, last year there was one match from the south of Norway to Iceland. But these whales that were seen, they had been seen already a few times in Iceland, but they were only seen once in the south of Norway, and they do not belong to the main catalog that, you know, are of the like better known individuals that visit the northern herring grounds. So we don't quite know what these whales are up to, but there was one match at least, you know, between Iceland and Scotland. We also had, I didn't touch upon that, but the Norwegian herring has resumed its migration to the east and northeast coast of Iceland, which it used to do before it collapsed, before the 1960s. And so since, I don't want to get this wrong, but like 2010 or 12 or so, around then, it has started again to come back to Iceland. So now we have Norwegian herring also in Icelandic waters for at least part of the year. And it's increasing. So the time they're spending in Icelandic waters. And so one of the things we've been really interested in is using the PAM data, because we do have some deployments in the east and in the northeast. And we did get one, which we think is a Norwegian call match in that data set. But it's a very, very small data set. So we're really keen to put more recorders in the areas where the Norwegian herring is spending most of its time, because these recorders we had was for the bottlenose whales for Paul's project. And so they're very, very deep. They're not adequate at all for detecting killer whales. They're more for deep divers. So we're hoping to put them in a more suitable location to get better quality sounds from the killer whales and really try to see if we see now more movements, because we do have some very small data set from fishermen that are fishing Norwegian herring, and they take some pictures because they see killer whales all the time. They see lots of killer whales. And so one very enthusiastic fisherman is sending us pictures, and most of the individuals, only one of them was known. All of the others, we don't know who they are. So they are new to the catalog of Iceland. So that's something we're really keen to explore further in the future, to see more whether there's connectivity. The other thing I just want to quickly mention is also we have a student doing more genetic work with Andy Foot. So looking at kind of the genetic comparisons across the whole of the North Atlantic. So comparing also Norwegian with Icelandic, now that there are more samples from both locations and from Greenland as well. And so the second question was about the herding call. Now this is very cool, because it seems to be like a strategy that only the Icelandic whales really have figured out. So the Norwegian ones, they have never been detected doing it. The only other location where they have this particular call has been recorded was off Scotland, when a group was seen feeding on herring in Scotland, off Shetland. But this was a group that included whales that were photographically known from Iceland. So we can't say for sure that it has, you know, that is also produced by Scottish whales, because it was kind of a group that had Icelandic whales. So far, it's only really the Icelandic population that we know of that makes this call. But like I said, they don't make it all the time. So we're really keen now with the tag data, especially, I mean, we don't have video for the whole length of the tag, but for those periods when we have video, we want to see, is it only when there's like a smaller school of herring, or what are the kind of factors that make them choose to use the herding call or not in each specific feeding event. I can talk a lot if you ask me questions, sorry.
So thank you for your interesting presentation. So I have one question of pilot whale of feeding ecology. So because in North Pacific, pilot whale fed mainly on squid. But in Iceland, pilot whale fed mainly on herring. Is that correct? No.
So the pilot whales, we don't really know for sure. It is most likely they're feeding a lot on squid. That's why we are doing all the squid sampling. So we are trying, because also squid are not very well studied in Iceland. So there wasn't existing studies on the stable isotopes of the squid. So we're trying to get samples of squid to measure their stable isotopes. And then we're getting samples of the pilot whales to measure their stable isotopes. And then we compare all three, like the squid, the killer whales, or four, actually, the herring and the pilot whales. Now, we've done already some analysis of the pilot whales' stable isotopes, and they are very different from the killer whales. So they don't seem to be feeding on the same thing, that I can say already. So it doesn't seem like it's herring that the pilot whales are going for. But the other thing that fishermen, for example, mentioned, and we saw also that could be something associated with this kind of recent resurgence of pilot whales into this area, is mackerel. So fishermen had said, we see more pilot whales because there's mackerel now in Icelandic waters. And we know that mackerel is an important prey in some parts of the North Atlantic for pilot whales. At least seasonally, it could be an important prey. So the other thing we are trying to do is study a little bit, also introduce mackerel into this kind of picture of the stable isotopes, and then see if it might be that is driving the pilot whales in. And then we do have mackerel in our area. And so we've never seen any signs of the killer whales feeding on mackerel, but it is a very similar, arguably, fish to herring. So it's also a fatty fish, so it could be that killer whales are going for it. But we haven't seen any evidence of that from observations or from the stable isotopes. But that's also another thing we have to consider with the pilot whales. That might be what is driving them to the same area as the killer whales. It's the presence of mackerel. And this summer, past summer, we had a couple of weeks when we had a lot of pilot whales in our area. And then we got an observation. There were hundreds of birds diving and getting fish from the same location where the pilot whales were. And then we confirmed that it was mackerel. So we're very excited because it seems like there is some kind of connection with the existence of mackerel in the area and then the pilot whales coming in. But we still need the samples to really confirm that.
Yes, thank you, Filipa, for your study and for your presentation. Even though this might not have been the primary topic of your study, but since you are dealing with the prey and the feed, do you have any indications of the volume that are being consumed? Of course, it's very complex, and it's also different species of that are being consumed. But as an official of the Ministry of Food, Agriculture and Fisheries, this is always a concern of the industry. How much are the whales consuming of the fish that the fishermen are then catching? So I don't expect a clear answer, but do you have any indications? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So the short answer is no. The longer answer is that we want to do modeling. So it has been done in the past, modeling for how much prey the whales would need. But there are several factors that we don't know exactly. One is what is the size of the population of killer whales that is feeding on herring. And the fact that we see whales with different feeding techniques makes things very complicated in terms of estimating how many whales are feeding exclusively on herring, or what is the proportion for those that have a mixed diet, what is the proportion of their diet that is herring, composed of herring versus other prey. So the studies we are doing are showing that the picture, at least for me, and I'm not an expert on this at all, it seems like it's more complex than we previously thought, that we can just say, okay, there's 1,000 whales and they all feed on herring, so let's just calculate how much herring they need. So that's why so far we don't know, but that is something we want to work on, trying to understand, because the Icelandic herring goes through these kind of phases of, being quite big, well, relatively big, nothing compared to the Norwegian stock, but relatively big, and then not so big. And the other thing we want to understand also is how maybe in times when there's not in times when there's not enough Icelandic herring, if there's Norwegian herring coming in, I don't think the whales really care if it's Icelandic or Norwegian. If it's there, they will eat it. So that's the other thing that also complicates when both stocks are potentially in the same area, is which stock are the whales feeding on for management purposes. So it's difficult, at least for me. I think it's a complicated, question.
Because all your answers have been long, this will be the last question today. This one will be the last.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay. I was just wondering if your ID catalog is big enough to make some sort of abundance estimate, but now you just said that you don't have that, so so because you kind of already answered my question.
Okay, then we have room for one more. Yeah.
It was just to follow up with what Jon was asking, that we did publish the paper in 2022 with Mette Mauritzen that was looking at or estimating the prey consumption of a whole range of marine mammals in the whole North Atlantic, or in this region of it. So, and I'm pretty sure killer whales are in there. I don't remember the results, but they're certainly in that. But it's of course based on a lot of assumptions and things that we still don't know.
Okay. Thank you very much, Filipa. There is catering outside, so. Okay. Okay.
Okay, so very, very quickly about the catalog. So the problem is that the majority of our data is done on the summer spawning ground, where only a percentage of the population is coming. So we know that, in the wintering grounds, there's a lot more whales than we are seeing in the summer spawning grounds. So, I am not an expert on population abundance estimates, so I don't know how we deal with that. With the fact that we don't know also what percentage of the population we are getting. We know that it's only a percentage, but we don't know what percentage we are getting. So, that's what's been complicating our efforts of estimating the abundance. That's all I'll say.
You will be there. Filipa will be outside. You can ask a question.